Hello, everybody. My name is Deborah Nelson. I am the Dean of the Division of the Arts and Humanities. And welcome to our final Dean Salon of the year. We typically do a Dean Salon each quarter to showcase the incredible breadth and vitality of our faculty's work. This fall, we were in conversation with Augusta Reed Thomas, who is one of her generation's premier composers, and she was taking us inside the composer's studio to talk about how she went from a blank page to the work that was going to be premiered with the New York Philharmonic the next night. In the winter, we hosted Adrian Brown, a professor of English, and Robin Bartram, who is a professor at the Crown School of Social Work, to talk about the cultural fantasies and racial realities of homeownership in the U.S. And today we are partnering with Alumni Weekend to share our work with you. I hope everybody saw our announcement about the renaming of the division. We are now the Division of the Arts and Humanities, and I'm very excited about our future. I know you hear every day two things: higher ed is under fire and the humanities are dying, and those two things are not we are under fire, but the humanities are not dying and the arts are not dying at the University of Chicago. The humanities helps us understand who we were, who we are, and who we might become. And those are life-changing experiences that start in the first year of the college, as probably all of you know, and that is the gateway to the University of Chicago, is through the humanities core, the arts core, and languages. The name change formally acknowledges and articulates two important things. We enroll more undergraduates than any other division. And we had 30% of the college graduates last year graduated with a minor or a major in the humanities. That is 10% higher than when Paul Alicevados graduated in 1981. So this is a mark of strength and growth rather than decline and despair. The arts excellence at Chicago has been building by leaps and bounds over the past 30 years. So we have had great artists and famous artists in the past, like Saul Bellow and Shulamit Ron, but now we have great arts programs in creative writing, theater and performance studies, media arts and design, cinema and media studies, media arts and design, music, and theater and performance studies. I want to give you two examples from our alumni faculty. Both of these, one graduated from the college, one earned her PhD here, but Ling Ma, the novelist and MacArthur winner, you may have read her novel Severance when it was showered with awards when it first came out, and you most certainly might have read it during the pandemic when it was on every book club's reading list that you would read and discuss over Zoom. Jacqueline Stewart has returned to the university from being the founding museum director at the Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles, and she is hosting her Silent Sunday movies on Turner Classics here on campus. And so this is just two small examples of the kind of riches that are available to the city of Chicago, our neighborhood, and our students. Today we're going to be talking about how new digital methods are being employed in the humanities division to think about history, culture, art. We are a leader in digital humanities, and so we are really digging in hard to think about how AI is changing everything we do. There are the upsides and the downsides of this, but we are thinking about this seriously from a teaching perspective and from a research perspective. Today we're going to be talking about research. Our first guest is going to be Niall Atkinson. He is an associate professor in the departments of art history and romance languages, and he is going to be talking about Florence Illuminated, a multi-year collaborative project that was recently defunded by the NEH, and along with his collaborators and along with all of our other NEH grants, National Endowment for the Humanities. Hoyt Long is a professor of Japanese literature and the chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. And he had a project, or has a project, we're trying to keep all this going, called Nodes, with the library and other university collaborators. And he'll talk about some of the digital work he's been doing over the past decade, I think, at this point. So Neil, do you want to start? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Debbie. It's an honor to be here. And thank you for coming, everyone. As Debbie said, I'm working on a collaborative project in digital humanities project in Renaissance Florence in the 15th century. And it was in the 1420s, the Florentine government found itself in the midst of a severe and sustained fiscal crisis. There were two reasons for this. One was the ongoing wars with Milan, and the other reason was the fact that their taxation system was basically hiring people in various neighborhoods to determine who got to pay how much in tax to the executive government. And that led to all kinds of corruption. And it also raised disappointingly little money at the same time, as people were constantly paying off each other. So the government decided to overhaul its tax system. And the result was the first modern taxation system in Europe. It meant that every household had to declare a tax return, just as we do today, and they had to list all of their debts and credits so that their net worth could be established by the government and their tax assessed. And what that leaves us with, and let me just show you here, this is a 15th century tax return, which is probably as complicated to read as a contemporary American tax return, at least for me. However, we, by the generous funding of the Neubauer Collegium, here at the University of Chicago, we were able to pay scholars for 2 years to transcribe every single tax return from the 1427 tax census, put that into spreadsheets, and it is now sitting on a database here at the University of Chicago. Census does is a couple of things. On the one hand, it says that you will only be taxed on your properties that you do not live in. And everything in the property you live in is not taxable as well. So what that did was stimulated investment in one's own principal residence. At the same time, it also redefined the family as living within a distinct household and not a kind of extended clan, which had been the familial identity of Florentines up until that time. And so just showing you here the famous Medici Palace, which was in a way a direct result of this tax overhaul. And it created what we now understand as the Renaissance typology Renaissance Palace, which is the type of architecture that did not really exist as a distinct entity before this tax reform. And what it also did was give us an enormous amount of demographic data about people and where they lived, who they owed money to, who owed them money, and all the properties they owned. And so what we were able to construct, and this is working with Carmen Caswell here in the Digital Forum for Digital Culture here, we created this cadastral grid. And what I'm showing you here is basically the locational information of where the famous artist Botticelli's father lived in 1427. And so what you see here in the middle is an individual property identified. And in order to give an address, everyone had to locate their property by saying who owned the property next to them, because there were no street addresses or sort of formal address system in 1427. And this has allowed us, or will allow us, and this is what the NEH grant that we won and lost was going to help us to do, and that was to then transcribe or translate that data into what you're seeing here, a system of edges and nodes in which streets and squares are linked to properties, and properties are linked to people, and people are linked to other people. So you got a whole sort of system of relationships out of this digital infrastructure, which we can then start to populate a new map of Florence that doesn't exist yet. That's where we're trying to reverse engineer a map of Florence in 1427 at that moment which, the massive sort of transformations in terms of arts and culture that Florence participated in throughout the 15th and into the 16th century, we're on the cusp of that moment. And so we're going to be able to build a map And here we just located a few of the properties in the neighborhood where Botticelli grew up. So these are his neighbors. And what it allows us to do is to take an artist who is so central to the European canon, right, of aesthetic discourse, and to put him back into his neighborhood, right? To put him back into his local context out of which he came, and to also understand the relationships that he had with other Florentines and their relationships, right, to artists that we see as part of a larger Western tradition. And so he's also buried in the church nearby, which probably explains why this painting by Botticelli is in that church. And so once you begin to understand where people lived, who they were connected to this map, a larger story unfolds, or a larger series of micro-histories unfold about why things are the way they are. And one of the really interesting things about this project, and this is what the NEH grant was about, it was to integrate this project called Catasto, which was going to form the basis of a demographic map, and then integrate four other related digital projects sprawled across several other academic institutions in the United States and Italy, one in which was mapping the death burial practices of Florentines to create a kind of cartographic or topographic image of how they buried themselves over several centuries, as well as another colleague who is building 3D models of current, extant, but also lost monuments back into a cartographic online environment where anyone can come and take a look at both who lived where and enter into the monuments themselves. And what that project allows us to do is to take the works of art out of museums and put them back into the places where they originally were, into a virtual environment. And finally, another colleague is also contributing data to this project in which we'll be able to zoom into individual households, and through the inventories of those households, find out what kinds of things Florentines owned. And what we're finding out already is that even the most modest artisans are collecting objects of art, as well as reading books at a time before printing technology was invented. And so you get, I think, a much more nuanced and granular sense of what the Renaissance meant at the everyday level with a project like this. However, today marks the 1 month anniversary of the termination of our grant. And so Debbie has been wonderful in thinking about strategies for how we move forward, and we've been talking with our team about how we can keep this project on the go. But I want to thank you very, very much for coming and listening. And I want to hand it over to my colleague, Hoyt Long.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I thought I would just introduce you briefly to a couple of the kinds of projects that I've been working on that, bring digital methods together with humanistic questions. Before I get there, I just wanted to sort of give a brief story of how I got to this point, because I haven't always worked in this space of digital methods. And in fact, I began as a Japanese literature scholar using very kind of traditional objects to study particular authors, books, newspapers, manuscripts, and if anybody recognizes this, microfiche. This was where as a PhD student, these were the tools that I was using to understand a particular author at a particular place and time. But I wasn't interested in just sort of thinking about the texts on their own. I really, as somebody interested in book history and sociology, wanted to understand the social lives of these texts. Like, how do the ideas and aesthetic kind of styles represented in these texts, how did they interact with those of other writers at the time, and how did they circulate beyond the confines of the writer? So to do that, of course, I had to go to other types of, we'll call that archival infrastructure, bibliographies, indexes, publisher records, compendia, library catalogs. These were all available to me, but sort of represent that next layer above the actual artifacts and primary sources. But as I did my PhD work, the infrastructure of humanities scholarship was also changing. Digitization of massive amounts of text through digital collections. Google, also the keyword search, right, as a kind of a new way to think about how to explore large amounts of data. which led to things like the Ngram viewer and other more complicated kind of computational techniques for extracting meaning and information from large bodies of text. And of course, the newest elephant in the room, ChatGPT, which I don't use for research at this point, but it is a kind of a new entrant into the practice of scholarship today. One of my projects touches upon AI and large language models, so I wanted to sort of present this. But as the sort of the infrastructure changed, it also caused me, forced me to sort of think about new directions that I could explore in my research. And essentially has taken two paths. One is thinking about sort of how these new technological layers, what new opportunities do they afford researchers for exploring questions now at larger scales across a wider variety of texts. And so I began to think about how you might use some of these tools to explore the past, to explore the body of literature that I knew well, which was Japanese literature of the early 20th century. And in this book, I sort of explore precisely that question. How do you take some of these tools and actually engage with them and experiment with their ability to sort of grapple with questions that humanists have long had about aesthetic style, about the evolution of aesthetic style and genre, but now not just looking at 10 or hundreds of texts, but potentially thousands. And what sort of challenges does that arise in sort of how we think about what humanities scholarship is good at, close reading? How does that change the nature of the scholarship? And can these two kinds of modes of thinking, a qualitative and a quantitative, exist side by side? But technology was also having a profound effect on the shape of culture itself. And this has sort of led me to a variety of different projects that are really interested in how technology, and here think of the internet, think of social media, think of platforms, algorithms, how they're changing the way that culture circulates, how we consume it, how it's produced. So I became very interested in sort of using the digital tools on born digital media, right? What are some of the ways in which culture is now being produced and consumed? So I've looked at, online writing and its relationship to the COVID pandemic, exploring questions about how tools like machine translation might change or enlarge the way we think about world literature. Thinking increasingly about television and global streaming platforms, television and politics. Polarization is obviously something that's impacting us on a daily level. So how do we think about culture's part in that? And then finally, thinking about large language models and creative writing. These are just some of the sort of the projects that I've meandered through over the last decade. I've come to think about this work, sort of to think about like what this work is or what I'm doing. One way to think about it is cultural intelligence, which by that I don't mean what you know, like how much you know, but really how you know it on the one hand. So like how have the mental toolkits for how we think about culture changed, and how does that change the ways that we know, that we come to understand culture, but also how this, with technology's sort of transformations of how culture circulates, how is, the culture that we use to think about, the culture that we use to think with, how is that also changing? So these sort of describe the two areas that I've just shown you. Let me sort of concretize that a little bit by showing you two projects that get at both of these issues. So one is from a project called Niche Worlds, how streaming platforms changed attention and reception. And just to give you a very quick introduction, one of the case studies for this project is the show called Squid Game. Many of you may have heard of it. It's came out in 2021 in the height of the pandemic, and some of the really sort of fundamental questions we want to sort of think about with this work is how did a show like that come to sort of garner all the attention that it did? How can we understand the reception of this show in the current moment, and what made it travel the world in the ways that it did? I think, traditionally, humanists would have looked at the show itself. It's sort of the content and the formal features to try to understand that. But we now live in a world where things circulate, for a whole host of reasons that have to do with the technologies through which they circulate, the platforms and the producers that are making them. And so we wanted to try to get a kind of a new understanding of that using the digital methods at our disposal. The text is very small here. I apologize for this, but it's just to give you a sense of, one thing that we did was sort of use various industry data that's available to us to understand how Squid Game's reception compared to hundreds of other shows that were playing in the marketplace at that time and across 20 different national markets. What does Squid Game look like in the context of that broader reception? Because to understand its uniqueness, what it did, why it succeeded, you have to sort of think about it in this larger framework. Squid Game is up here, and basically this graph shows you which shows did very well, both across these 20 markets, but also did very well in specific markets. And the shows that are up on the top right, we call these kind of the standout superstars. These are shows like Game of Thrones, like The Walking Dead, Mandalorian, Stranger Things, that had this kind of global range in terms of the attention that they got. And Squid Game fits right up there. But one of the things we learned was that Squid Game is the only Korean show to sort of make it into that top tier. Most of the other internet or foreign non-US shows in that tier were from Japan. A lot of anime, things that your kids might be into. My kids certainly are. Most of the Korean shows that had garnered attention did not sort of have that same level of breadth. And Indian shows even less so. So what we understood from this is essentially that Squid Game had somehow been able to catapult itself out of that second tier. And so now part of the project is to explore why that is, both through looking at social media reception and also other avenues to think about, what does it share with some of these other global hits that help us then to sort of understand what it was doing. One other project I just wanted to briefly share. Obviously, AI and large language models are something that many of us in the humanities are thinking about, or just you're trying not to think about. I think there's a couple of different responses to that. But my philosophy has been that these tools are out there. They are things our students are using, and it's best to try to engage with them on our own terms, to sort of bring them back into our fold and really address, make them the kinds of tools that we want them to be, or that will be useful to us. One of the things that has become apparent is that when people use these tools, they're using them for creative tasks like creative writing. They also use them for homework. That's the second category here. But what I was really curious as to, if large language models are having an impact on, how writers work, how they think about, how they get ideas, how they get feedback, how can we begin to sort of understand what kinds of feedback or impact that might have on their activity. So this is sort of to get at another set of questions is like, what is the impact of these tools on human creativity, and how do we evaluate that? And can we evaluate that through sort of the practices and knowledge bases that we've spent decades developing in the humanities? So just to give you a high-level overview of the experiment, we were curious how an AI would respond to different types of writing, specifically by professional writers and amateur writers who are, of varying genders. And so we presented 400 passages that focused on characterization. We wanted to make the question specific about that technique, and we asked these LLMs to sort of rate the level of the quality of characterization on a number of different dimensions, and to provide feedback. One of the things that we found is that these LLMs tend to harbor certain biases, and the way that they treated male professional writers on the whole was much different than female amateur writers. And certain biases emerged in that the men received higher scores, more positive feedback, and more revisions, meaning more engagement in their work, whereas the writing by female amateurs received lower scores, less positive feedback, and fewer revisions. The men were also more often recommended Pulitzer Prize-winning novels like The Remains of the Day or The Kite Runner, where the women were recommended Pride and Prejudice, The Hunger Games, Harry Potter. So you can see here, this captures really well at sort of a systematic level some of the biases that come from the long historical record of how writing and gender have intersected. These have been encoded in the machine. So with this knowledge, what can we do? How can we sort of help people understand what it is to use these tools when they go to them, hopefully trying to get a non-judgmental response or to get some feedback. They may do that thinking that these tools are neutral, but of course, through these kinds of studies, we can understand specifically the ways that they have systematic biases built into them. And this is just to sort of showcase a larger set of studies where we're trying to use humanistic tools to evaluate and assess the capabilities of large language models. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to ask a couple of questions, and one thing that's always fascinated me as these tools have emerged is this something that Hoyt mentioned, which is the kind of close and detailed reading that is the bread and butter of all of our disciplines in some way, and the very, very large scale. And so one thing I was hoping you might talk about, Niall, is you now have Botticelli so we all know Botticelli, or even if we don't know Botticelli, we know Botticelli because we've seen his paintings. But what changes about thinking about Botticelli's work? The thing that interested me was you said, well, now we know that they're all hanging in these homes in different ways. That's a different display space than a museum. We take the museum to be some sort of like, okay, that's how painting works. But it's not how painting works. And it certainly wasn't how a painting worked in 1427. So how has it started to change your thinking?
Thank you. Yeah, it is a way for us, or what we have seen is the ways in which works of art and artists, right, that have been extracted from it, like their Florentine context, right, and then set sort of adrift into a larger sort of teleological narrative about a certain progressive form of creative genealogy to where we get today, and it re-embeds them into the local context, and it also allows us to see. I'm an architectural historian as well, so I'm very interested in the ways in which the stuff we imagine to be the fine arts coexisted and was directly speaking right to the everyday, so that people would go into churches and they would see Botticelli paintings and they would pray in front of them and they would maybe just sort of casually hang around. It was part of their sort of normal everyday. And what really interests me is thinking about the ways in which a period that is so revered by us, how was it understood or valued by the people who actually lived through it? Did they imagine that they were living through a renaissance of culture? And in a sense, yes and no. But for them, it was a much more ground level, right? And so we see a situation also where you see art embedded in certain kinds of economic and political strategies, right? So you have patrons who are it's the banking and textile sector that is underwriting this stuff primarily. Those merchants that are building their big houses, employing architects, as well as artists to construct a kind of topography of their power and identity. The palace becomes sort of a stand-in for the idea that family has about its own power politics within the city, even though it's also an international monument. And so not just the palaces which have been extracted, this project allows us to also see the whole real estate portfolio of everyone who owned property and to see how was that palace surrounded by a whole system of rented structures, magazines, stables, apartment blocks, and things like that. And so you get you see the ways in which these cultural objects and cultural figures are re-embedded into a world in which we would be familiar with, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Hoyt, I wanted to know, you have found even some of the basic information that you're showing us here like the fact that the number one use for the LLM is creative. So having a teenager, I would have expected it to be homework. And homework is our current bête noire in the humanities division, because we are the ground level teachers of writing and really careful reading skills. And our students are now coming to us with a much greater familiarity with LLMs than we have ourselves in many cases. So do you have any account for why creativity is it because most people have a yearning to be a creative writer, and so it has vaulted them into this? Or do you have any understanding of, so there's other kinds of work you get, like qualitative work, like how do you actually talk to people about their use of the ChatGPT as an engine of creativity?
Yeah, great question. And there are qualitative studies, some of which have informed this research, which go and ask writers of different backgrounds and at different stages in their career, what is it that they derive from these tools? And you find that a lot of them go for things like brainstorming, right? They have writer's blocks, or they're stuck. They want to just bounce some ideas, and they don't want to have to ask a friend or go to a teacher. So that's one use, is to just sort of at that generative process. There's very few writers who go and say, like, write me a story, because what would be the point, right? That takes that really sort of ruins that goes against kind of what they want to do, which is to sort of produce new creative material. A lot of these studies also reveal, I mentioned this briefly, is that that writers who are just trying out a new idea and want some feedback, there's a certain sense of set of social obligations you enter into when you have to go ask your creative writing teacher or an instructor or a friend. You don't want to get sometimes you want to just get positive feedback, right? You want encouragement. And so a lot of writers express that as a reason, just as a kind of a first stage to get some encouragement to keep on going. And part of the impetus for this study was to at the individual level, it may feel, in fact, like you aren't being judged. But when you look at it systematically and sort of bring in the different kind of social identities that writers have, whether as beginning writers or professionals or men or women, all of a sudden you see these patterns emerge that suggest that there is a judgment built in, whether you want it or not. And so kind of exposing those was really to help writers. And I should mention that those biases emerge whether or not you tell the LLM that you are a man or a woman or an amateur or a professional. It doesn't matter. Somehow it intuits from the writing itself. And in fact, the biases increase if you identify yourself. So, but sort of helping writers and creatives understand the limitations of these tools, but also how they might work better with them and their limitations.
Yeah. So both of you work on periods of rapid technological change, the early 20th century, the Renaissance and the birth of print culture. And we are in a moment of rapid technological change. And, the importance of thinking about using the humanities to think through these questions. This is not our first go around with some of these questions. So, Niall, I know one thing from your research is that when print culture started to get going, yes, we had an explosion of literacy, but we also had an explosion of plagiarism, misinformation, quackery, and all kinds of things that accompanied the explosion of print. So what do you see? I mean, what are the sort of parallels? What are the novelties? How does the Renaissance, how does that moment in the 15th century in Florence help us think about what we're experiencing now?
Yeah, I think it's extremely relevant. And if you imagine that our sort of our attitude towards literacy, I think, is one that 15th and 16th century Europeans would not really understand, because there's a great deal of anxiety about this new technology and the ways in which it would let loose into God forbid, the masses, a certain amount, all kinds of information and knowledge that was carefully guarded, not only by the church, but by elites about, ancient culture and the established norms of how you copy, interpret, and then redistribute that knowledge and maintain a certain elite circle of it. And so now you have, but one of the most liberating things was, for example, the most famous poem in Italy in the early 16th century was Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, an epic romance hybrid that was copied, recopied, and printed and sold in really cheap editions. Fragments of it were available of it. Prose editions were available of it. All kinds of what we would imagine like Cliff Notes versions of it. Summaries. So a whole range of inexpert and quality reproductions, but it allowed so many more people access to what was going on in what was so-called high culture. And so the bridge between that was extremely important. At the same time, though, people realized you could also start monetizing someone else's work in a way that didn't require you to do much work to do so, that you could misrepresent it, you could change a few things, you could just keep printing the same mistakes over again, you could deliver versions that were just fragments, you could deliver versions with the wrong titles on them, and it didn't matter if you could sell them. And so there was a great deal of what we would understand as corruption of information. And as well, you had, as you mentioned, the quackery, where you have people selling stuff, texts that were purportedly contained all kinds of information you needed to either get rich, to get healthy, to save your soul, to increase your devotional capacity before God and whatnot. And these people would be speaking in the public squares night after night, not unlike, I remember, it's told now, but I remember Tony Robbins. Do you remember, if you remember Tony Robbins? Promising the kind of riches and getting so close to giving it away until you had to buy the damn thing, and so that was at work as well. So the structures and practices, for example, of say what we understand now as journalistic practice about what truth is and about what is honest and fair and ethical, those practices didn't exist because no one had experienced such an explosion, right, of the and diffusion of knowledge and ideas through print culture, and who were now the gatekeepers, and that was all up in the air, and we ended up in some bad places, I think. And so I related this to a course that I teach on the history of the public square, because I was lying in my hotel room at a national conference in 2011 in New York and watching Al Jazeera English and the Arab Spring uprisings and looking at the ways in which access to new technologies, in this case it was Facebook and Twitter way back then, were allowing revolutionaries to organize, right, to get out, to avoid, right, certain places and then certain police crackdowns and whatnot, and helped fuel a whole series of popular revolutions. I mean, the end of that story is not particularly happy, nor is the end of that story in terms of, wow, that I had never imagined that social media, maybe I should have, had I realized and looked back at the 15th and 16th centuries and said, you know what, we're in for some real trouble here. And I think that, social media unleashed similar kinds of liberatory practices, but we weren't ready for how people were able to so perniciously monetize those things and construct a culture in which misinformation parades as a certain kind of commodity, for example. And so maybe Hoyt, you can speak more about our current technologies, but it seems like we're repeating ourselves again.
I think all of these problems you've raised are super interesting and remind us of history's ability to just repeat itself. In my, one of the things that strikes me in terms of thinking about, why focus on popular culture? Why focus on the kind of the low culture, the trash of today? Why is that interesting? Typically when you think of humanities teaching, it's, spending time with a small group of individuals to work closely through a text, right? To disconnect from the world and pay attention to, how a novel is constructed, how it's written, what are the techniques used, and that's something I value too in my teaching. But there is this irony in that oftentimes, we're asking students to bring very close attention to the types of literature that 200 years ago were everybody hated because they saw it as only a distraction, right? When you think of Jane Austen or the novelists of her period, this was a time when literature was seen as the trash of its day, and people were all scared about, what is this doing to people's minds? This is where you get, countless studies about the nature of attention that starts in the 19th century, and we're sort of here again, kind of confronted with this problem. And so I think, while figuring out how to provide students those skills to slow down, to really reflect on how a particular piece of art is constructed, how is it working. It's also important to sort of meet them at their level in terms of thinking about what are the cultural distractions of their day. And the reason those are distractions is because they are also they are helpful tools or useful tools for individuals to think about their relationship to society, right? To explore other personalities, to sort of get lost in stories that maybe are not, that maybe touch you in some way, or precisely because they are outside of your world, there are stories you want to jump into. So a lot of the time I'm finding myself thinking about, or why I want to study sort of media of the present, is to really explore those social and psychological questions of how stories at the very basic level are animating the ways people think about themselves and their relationship to the world.
Do we want to take some questions from the audience?
I'm just curious what you think about the level of violence in some of the Japanese current culture.
Yeah, I think that, where you see that violence really depends on the genre, on the medium that's in question. I have a teenage son, so, he watches a lot of anime, and I often am watching alongside him and am surprised at the level of, the blood and gore that are part of these. I think I would hesitate to sort of the explanation for why that's there and how violence becomes part of those genres is a long story and a complicated one, and one it's hard to boil down to singular reasons. And whether the exact effects of that on youth or people in general also is, there are certainly studies to try to get at that, but that connection isn't entirely well understood, or whether or not that that violence, the imagination of violence in a video game or an anime actually leads to violence in the real world. So
and that's a debate. I study the 20th century U.S. culture, but the horror comics that came out really kind of the end of the 40s and the 50s were part of the sort of big brouhaha over juvenile delinquency, is what was called at the time, and the banning of certain kinds of comics. And, they're pretty gruesome. But I don't know if it's more gruesome now, but I think we have these periodic eruptions of these questions across cultures, and it is hard to make a one-to-one correspondence. But it's kids. Part of Hoyt's work that I think is important is now kids are consumers of global versions of teen culture or young adult culture. I mean, so there's so much competition for their time and attention. I wonder, if some of that has accelerated the kind of intensity of material that they're consuming.
For sure, yeah, and it is, again, I think it's a problem that demands further study. Sort of thinking about what level of exposure is there? Is that more intense than times past? And does that actually, does that lead to sort of real world social consequences? But these are all, sorts of questions that we as humanists can explore.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. This is fascinating. So this is a question for Professor Atkinson. Before these fascinating methods, there was obviously a deep understanding of the Renaissance period and in Florence. And I guess my question, and that's mainly through the traditional of close reading of texts and other things like that we're all familiar with from having gone through the Common Core. But my question, I guess, for you is, by applying these methods, have you been surprised about something that challenges the prior understanding of things?
Yeah, I will say that we were only like 10% into our grant before, but not to put too fine a point on it.
Elections have consequences, unfortunately.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. But I think it's a way. What has surprised me the most is the part, and because I thought this wasn't the case. I sort of came from the studies before this. I was sort of trying to deal with this sort of what is known as sort of Florentine exceptionalism. That everything was invented here: the Italian language, astronomy, modern cartography. The birth of realism in art, for example, the rediscovery of the ancient world, and then that modern. Someone has even said the American Republic is based as Florence was a prototype for that kind of political organization. And to undo, just to think about or critique that kind of exceptionalism, and to think that, and think about the ways in which it was more integrated. But I couldn't do it really. I didn't know. There was no evidence at that point that a massive amount of people were as engaged in cultural patronage, for example. We think of the great patrons, the Medici, for example, because they plowed, billions, the equivalent of billions, into culture, because they realized at that moment that, this is a legacy worth thinking about. Philanthropy is not just giving away money to artists and they just go, it's actually an investment in your own culture and your own future, for example. But now that we are starting to have a finer, more granular understanding of what people were doing, who they were consorting with, the kinds of business, economic, and social connections people had. That's what the map allows us to see. We can see that people are actually participating in really interesting ways, and that they were demanding access, right, to those kinds of cultural phenomena. So I think that it is the diminishment of that exceptionalism to show how it was really based on conditions and relationships that were completely recognizable.
I'm going to address the issue of using large language models in writing as an example of a male amateur writer who needed to meet. Exigency was the motivation for me. I wanted to write my own scene for an acting reel that I'm continually working on, and I didn't know one whit about how to write a screenplay. So I found a platform that does that. I gave it a 200-word summary. It spit out about 40 pages of a screenplay in less than 20 minutes. Scary. I'm planning to not use it as such, with the exception of the words and the. And I contrast that with an example of what it took me to write a monologue for a performance, where it took me 2 weeks to do it. Personally, I like the 2-week version than the 20-minute version. And but exigency really, really, because TV and film particularly TV, is fast. So you have to do it. At least, but it's it's too much of a temptation. So that's just an observation.
Were you satisfied with those 40 pages, or what it was?
It needs some work. Yeah. And in fact, as I'm thinking about it, I'm going to change some things. There's 2 scenes in the screenplay that I'm going to use for this particular scene, and I want to change it a lot, because I created a Frankenstein's monster. So it's just sort of an observation of what you're talking about.
No, thanks for sharing that. And I do think as we've been living in this world for at least 3 years now, one of the things we're finding is that the more expertise you have in an area, the less helpful these tools are. Whereas conversely,
Total amateur.
Yeah, if you don't know what you're doing, they can seem immensely helpful, precisely because they speed along that process of learning. And so I think recognizing that is important, and how we think about the relationship of these tools to education is really critical if students are using them for, tasks like reading or for writing that they haven't yet mastered. And so how to sort of get in there right before those tools have kind of given them that expedient means to arrive at a destination is really sort of one of the things we're one of our current challenges. But I think it's what I do in my own teaching is really just to acknowledge that these tools are out there and to have a conversation with students that you're going to live with these, and you need to learn how to. You can reject them, but if you're going to use them, you need to learn how to think with them and what's going to be the most effective way to do that. Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
No, it reminds me of something my daughter said when she was in about third grade. She said, I was the first one done on my math test. I didn't get any of them right, but I was the first one done. So that's where some of this is going. So, yeah, but, it's a really interesting thing to see, we have the advantage of knowing something so that you can look at what comes out of it and you can make an assessment of it. It's really going to be complicated for people who don't yet know anything. And the job of knowing things is changing too, right? If it's all accessible at our fingertips, we're going to have to figure that out.
Well, first of all, thank you. A question I had was about the large language model analysis and the bias that was unintended, but there nonetheless. Once you discover that, what do you do?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is to publish these results and sort of get responses from practitioners and the larger research community. And one of the things that both computer scientists and humanists are exploring is what options do we have for changing the way that these models operate? There are a lot of different avenues to do that. You can imagine training them on different types of data, on data that is not just taken from the internet and that contains all of the sort of unknown biases that are there, but training them on things that you think are more representative of, the literary past, or which, steer the model in different directions. This is one of the things that we had hoped to do with the NEH-sponsored UChicago Node project, which was to, connect with the library, who's very good at organizing digital sources, and these are sources that are not on the internet, have not been scraped up. These are highly curated collections. So one of the things that we wanted to explore, and we'll continue to do so as best we're able, is what do these models look like once they are trained on a set of texts that what those are, right? And the biases that are contained within them. Will they behave differently? So that's one response. And I think there are other avenues that are being explored, which may be at the level of the prompting. How can you use the prompts more creatively to steer them to places in the models? I don't want to personify it here, but in their imagination, right? Or in the space that the space of representation that they encode or that they capture. How can you direct it into those places that don't just sit at the average, right? But that sit on the edges of that distribution. So that's another thing that we're exploring. But this is really an active research area. And what I'm finding is that there are a lot of computer scientists and engineers who are desperate for humanistic knowledge because they want to move these models in directions that actually, recognize the complexity of meaning and the multiplicity of interpretations. And are there ways that we can imagine, re-engineering these models so that they actually reflect the complexity of thought and critical reasoning that we as humans have, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. No,
thanks for your question.
I think it's the Schmidt Foundation. Am I right? So Hoyt was asked by the Schmidt Foundation, which is a big funder of science, to develop a call for research proposals from humanists, precisely because of one way it's being characterized as AI winter, when you've kind of exhausted the thing that you have and you already know its limitations, and they really think that humanists are incredibly important to moving beyond that and through it. Large language models don't really understand things. They predict them, right? And we have an immense reservoir of understanding of how language works in context, how words have changed over time, what the kind of network around the work is that makes us able to understand it in a more complex way. These are basic tools of large numbers of our faculty and humanists across the country. So I think you'll probably see more of this as we move through these next few years, if people want to make the things better. Well, thank you very much.
Thank
And
you,
thank you
everybody.
for joining in.